In this video, we'll explore one of the most iconic historic structures in the upper Mississippi Valley of the United States, the Dubuque Shot Tower, an obelisk-like building that has stood for more than 165 years, just a short distance from the Mississippi River in the city of Dubuque, Iowa. With a long history of fires, neglect, and train accidents, it's almost a miracle that it has survived to the here and now. What was this curious building used for? Why is it here? And how did it persist to the present day?
Sources for this video include the George W. Rogers Shot Tower National Register of Historic Places nomination form, prepared by James E. Jacobson, period newspaper clippings, period maps, period photographs and drawings, U.S. Census records, and vital records. The story of the Dubuque Shot Tower originates in 1854, when a gunsmith by the name of George W. Rogers opened up a gun shop on 5th Street between Iowa and Main Streets in Dubuque, Iowa, where he sold rifles and pistols. Gentlemen can be furnished with guns by the day on reasonable terms, his ads proclaimed. We do not know many details regarding the life of George W. Rogers, only that he was likely born in Utica, New York, was approximately 40 years of age, was a metalworker or gunsmith by trade, and had at least one brother, Elisha H. Rogers, who was also a gunsmith.
At some point during the initial days of operation of his gun shop, Rogers determined to build a shot tower, a tall structure designed to make lead-shot bullets for the muskets and guns of the period. The principle, observed by Englishman William Watts in the 1780s, is that molten lead, like any liquid, will form almost perfect spheres in flight if dropped from sufficient height, as a result of surface tension. By the time the lead spheres hit the basin of water at the base of the tower, they have cooled sufficiently so that their spheroid form is preserved.
There were at least a few dozen of these structures in the United States by the mid-1800s, the first being built prior to the War of 1812. In fact, Rogers' primary competition for lead shot was 400 miles to the south, where the St. Louis Shot Tower stood steadfast to the north of St. Louis, from 1846 onwards. Another shot tower, or shot shaft, built in the 1830s was even closer, just 50 miles overland and 100 miles up the Mississippi and Wisconsin rivers, at Helena, Wisconsin.
By December of 1855, Rogers had purchased the property for the proposed shot tower on an island in the Mississippi River, which fronted the city of Dubuque. Rogers reportedly saw the tower as a promotional symbol to highlight the new industrial center being built on the Dubuque Island. There was also talk of the tower serving as something of a lighthouse for steamers on the Mississippi to guide them into the Dubuque harbor.
So why did Rogers think that building a shot tower in Dubuque would be a good investment? Dubuque was, of course, nestled close by several highly productive lead mining districts, with Galena, New Diggings, and Potosi to the east, as well as the mines of Spain right in its own backyard. Being situated along the Mississippi River would enable easy shipment of manufactured goods north and south. It also meant that materials, such as lead alloy and coal for the furnace, could be readily brought in. The equivalent today would be building a factory right next to the expressway.
The tower design was unusual in its overall form, that of an obelisk with subtle tapering sides. It was uncommon insofar as other shot towers were typically either round or square in shape. Who designed Rogers' shot tower is not clear. One possible candidate was Dubuque architect John Francis Raig. Given the tower's placement near the river, and given its height and weight, it was likely to have had a substantial and deep foundation, perhaps 10 to 20 feet deep. Much of the initial planning and work for the tower was likely consumed in creating this foundation.
The tower itself was completed by the end of October of that year, at a cost of about $7,000, or about $730,000 in today's money. At 150 feet tall, it was well built, the first 6 stories at 110 feet, being constructed of Galena limestone, while the top 3 stories, 40 feet tall, were made of common brick. 4 windows, one on each side, allowed light into each of the building's stories, while a single door at the base allowed ingress and egress. The walls at the base of the structure were about 20 feet wide and 3 feet thick, tapering as they rose on the outside to 12 inches thick, with a wall batter of a little over 1 degree, while the interior walls remained relatively straight from top to bottom, each story's interior being about 13 feet square. Just a few weeks after the building's construction, lead shot manufacturing within the structure was well underway.
A few contemporary newspaper reports describe the operation of the vertical manufacturing plant. You entered the first story of the building via a set of wooden stairs. To the left of the room was an inclined table, used for sorting out imperfect spheres, which would later be remelted. In the center of the chamber was a tank that was partially filled with water, which caught the newly formed shot as they fell from above. Directly in front of you was a 5-horsepower steam engine, along with a windlass, which were used for raising the lead alloy and other materials to the top floor.
A series of wooden ladders or stairs took operators from floor to floor. On the 9th floor, 140 feet above the ground, is where 300-pound batches of lead alloy were heated beyond the melting point in a furnace. Once in liquid form, the lead alloy was scooped up with a ladle and then poured onto a sieve, which consisted of an iron disc with small holes punched into its surface to enable the liquid lead to drip through. The lead drops plummeted 140 feet for about 3 seconds, forming perfect spheres on the way down due to surface tension.
Once the newly minted shot was collected in the water tank on the first floor, the spheroids were placed into another barrel-shaped tank, where they were rotated and tossed via the steam engine, with graphite as a lubricant, in order to smooth them further. They were then rolled across an inclined table into a container. Those that did not roll true were set aside to be melted down and remade. The polished and collected shot were then placed into an oscillating chamber, which contained strainer pans for sorting the manufactured shot into different sizes. Finally, the lead shot were weighed and bagged.
Managing the new shot factory turned out to be a full-time job for George W. Rogers. His brother, Elisha Rogers, arrived in Dubuque prior to the opening of the shot tower and bought out his brother's gunship business, reopening it under his management. Elisha, born in 1813 in Utica, New York, was already a noted gunsmith and ran a successful gun store far to the southeast, in Augusta, Georgia. This may have been part of their plan all along, to have George build and manage the factory, and Elisha to handle the gun store and gun making.
Perhaps George W. Rogers was over-leveraged by the building of the tower, or perhaps his finances collapsed with the panic of 1857, a recession that rocked the U.S. economy. But within a year of the business's opening, ownership of the shot tower had largely transferred from Rogers to local businessmen Peter Cook and William Langworthy. It was at about this time that a substantial wooden auxiliary building was added to the north side of the tower, about 40 feet long by 20 feet wide and standing on stilts, no doubt due to the periodic flooding of the nearby Mississippi River. The shed building was likely for storage of lead alloy and coal, as well as finished products. A few of the finishing operations, such as weighing and bagging of the shot, may have been moved into this auxiliary building as well.
Cook and Langworthy, with Rogers in the background, operated the shot tower seasonally for a few years, before it was leased to William Hyde Clark and Peleg Tallman in 1859, who apparently replaced and improved upon some of the machinery within the tower, such as the steam engine. The Clark and Tallman operation, too, was short-lived, and the property was sold off by the Dubuque County Marshal. due to delinquent taxes in public auction in March of 1860, to local businessmen Julius K. Graves and Gilbert Woodruff. Original owner George W. Rogers appears to have left the city of Dubuque by this time.
The Graves-Woodruff purchase was fortuitous, at least from a business perspective, as rumors of a civil war between the states began to circulate. After all, being in the munitions business in a time of war can be financially advantageous. And so it proved within the following year, in April of 1861. Graves, who was a banker by trade, was deeply patriotic to the Union and erected a U.S. flag high atop the shot tower in symbolic show of support shortly after the opening military engagements of the war between the states. Also fortuitous for Graves was the accidental burning and destruction of the shot tower in nearby Helena, Wisconsin, the nearest competition. Lead shot production at the Dubuque Tower started up again in earnest, with Peleg Tallman once again running the operation. Whether the new demand was coming from government contracts for the war effort or from private purchases is not entirely clear.
But this new surge in operations was not to last either. Although the lead shot business and market appeared strong, Julius Graves sold the shot tower to Gideon W. Chadbourne of the St. Louis Shot Manufacturing Company in July of 1862 for $3,000, or about $250,000 in today's money. Apparently, the Graves Shot Company had become too much of a rival to the larger St. Louis Shot Manufacturing Company to the south, and thus the St. Louis firm did what businesses often do. They purchased their competitor to shut it down. Graves, for his part, may have sold the tower for eminently practical reasons. Both he and his foreman, Peleg Tallman, were being personally swept up in the war effort. And in fact, Tallman died on the banks of the Mississippi River in Kentucky as a war correspondent in 1863. As part of the sale of the tower, Graves also reportedly was required to refrain from building another shot tower within 100 miles of Dubuque for a period of 10 years.
However, that did not stop Dubuque entrepreneurs from almost immediately establishing new lead shot manufacturing facilities, including one backed by Julius Graves. The same year as the sale of the shot tower, Graves, along with William Carter and Caleb Booth, built a new lead shot factory, not based upon a tower, but instead based upon a deep hole in the ground, repurposing a local abandoned lead mine, about 150 feet in depth. What's more, they were able to build this new facility at a fraction of the cost of erecting a new tower. By mid-1863, the Dubuque Shot Manufacturing Company was in full production, producing lead shot in quantity, and said to be of better quality than had been produced at the tower. A second lead shot factory, also utilizing an abandoned Dubuque lead mine, was opened up by local businessman James Hughes, and also with great success.
The disused and abandoned shot tower, meanwhile, stood silent along the Mississippi River. With the building of the Dunleith-Dubuque Bridge in 1868, the area to the north of the railroad right-of-way, including the tower location, became an industrial site and rail yard. The tower itself became a favorite haunt of local youths, climbing its aged stairs and carving their names into its balustrades. In early 1874, local attorney and art lover John Deary had the bright idea of installing a large wooden statue of General Andrew Jackson on horseback high atop the shot tower. The statue had been carved by local artist Thomas Cavanaugh and had been hoisted to its position by a steeplejack. There it remained for 7 years, until it was brought down in 1881, when the tower and property were purchased by Clarence J. LeSueur, a Wisconsin lumberman, for the paltry sum of $425, roughly the equivalent of $20,000 in today's money.
LeSueur and a few other investors then created the LeSueur Lumber Company, utilizing the shot tower property site, as well as several other adjoining lots, as an extensive lumber yard. LeSueur repurposed the shot tower as a fire watchtower to overlook these vast lumberyards along Illinois Central right-of-way. The very top of the tower was reconstructed to include a new single-story observation deck for this purpose, with a hip roof for protection from the elements and windows on all sides.
Bird's-eye maps and later Sanborn maps suggest that the period from 1880 to 1900 saw much of the infill of the area surrounding the shot tower. 1889 maps indicate that railroad tracks to the immediate south of the tower were elevated, high above the ground atop which the tower stood. Later maps indicate that this same area had been leveled up to the height of the railroad tracks, meaning that the tower site and surrounding land was infilled, substantially raising the ground level, no doubt to reduce the likelihood of flood damage to stacks of drying lumber. The height of the tower was reduced correspondingly, from 150 feet to 120 feet, as the bottom 20 feet or more were buried within this landfill.
In 1894, a huge fire broke out in the LeSueur lumberyard, which triggered Clarence LeSueur to sell out to the Standard Lumber Company, moving his operations to Duluth, Minnesota, while the shot tower remained. 17 years later, in May of 1911, another major conflagration consumed the lumberyard, which burned so brightly that it could be seen 10 miles in the distance, and burned so hot that the roof and interior of the nearby shot tower caught fire, completely gutting the tower, leaving it as an empty shell. The property owner, the Standard Lumber Company, sold its burned-out lumber yards and tower site for the sum of $1, or about $20 in today's money, to Michael H. McCarthy, himself a lumber merchant.
McCarthy, in turn, sold the grounds to the Allison Henderson Memorial Association for $12,000, quite a tidy profit for Mr. McCarthy. The association then undertook efforts to transform the area into a park. They later donated the land and the park to the city of Dubuque.
The disused shot tower, badly worn by time and deeply scarred by multiple fires, was falling into deep disrepair. It was, nonetheless, a local landmark, a structure that almost all members of the Dubuque community knew, from their earliest days till their last. Many had played on its rotting interior stairs as children, and it was a familiar sight to all citizens, standing proud high above the harbor and gleaming in the afternoon sun. In 1934, the shot tower was included in the Historic American Building Survey, Historic American Engineering Record. Various local groups made several aborted attempts to stabilize the tower or to improve the grounds, but none with lasting effect.
Finally, in 1959, a group of concerned Dubuque citizens raised sufficient funds to repair and renovate the tower. Within the following year, they had made substantial improvements to the structure so as to prevent further damage. The decaying exterior mortar was repointed. Wooden windowsills were replaced with poured concrete. Tie rods were installed through the building at multiple levels to stabilize the structure. The open roof of the tower was filled in with a 6-inch concrete slab to keep out rainwater and snow, while screening was added to the windows to keep out birds. A concrete collar was cast around the base of the tower, 3 feet in height and 1 foot in thickness.
In 1963, the shot tower was given historical marker status as a result of efforts by the Dubuque chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Several years later, as a result of flooding in 1969, the city of Dubuque built a flood wall along the nearby Mississippi, which helped to protect the lower stories of the building from flooding and water damage. The city even looked into dismantling the tower and moving it closer to the downtown district in the late 1980s, but no tangible plans materialized from that study. In 1991, the tower took another blow below the belt when a railroad car traveled beyond the end of the trackway and crashed into the tower's base. Fortunately, the thick walls of the tower protected it from serious structural damage.
The tower was more substantially renovated in the early 2000s, when significant funding was raised, including grants from the National Park Service and the State Historical Society of Iowa, to do more complete and long-lasting repairs to the interior and exterior mortar, as well as completely sealing the structure with new windows, a new roof, and a new door. The project also included an archaeological survey of both the building's interior as well as the surrounding terrain. Although the building was first nominated in 1976 for designation in the National Registry of Historic Places, it was not fully accorded this status until 2003.
The building that we see today, now more than 165 years old, has survived multiple fires, vandalism, and years of neglect. The fact that the tower has endured to the present day is something of a miracle. It is one of only a handful of such structures that have survived within the United States through the past 2 centuries. From its creation, George W. Rogers hoped it would serve as a symbol of industry and enterprise along Dubuque's waterfront. And even though he quickly faded into the patchwork quilt of Dubuque's long history, his shot tower nonetheless endured as a landmark to every citizen of Dubuque for several generations hence. For every boat that steamed north and south along the Mississippi, for every automobile that sped along the High Bridge, for every train that thundered along its base, and for every Dubuque citizen gazing to the east, the shot tower has continued to stand proud, a symbol of the city's abiding resilience.
If you are enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. It helps our channel to grow and enables us to make more videos just like this. And of course, we will see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.